my name is Morgan and I'm a neuroscience researcher, and today we're going to be reacting to an episode of the Vampire Diaries. Now, I know what you're probably thinking, Morgan, what could the Vampire Diaries possibly have to do with neuroscience? But actually, I've been rewatching the series recently, so this isn't a true reaction video, but I did watch this episode a couple of weeks ago. I'm much further into the series now. I have basically forgotten everything that's happened. But I did write down in season 5, they actually get kind of into a little bit of research and a little bit of science. And so I just really want to talk about what they did right, what they did wrong. A comment that I often get on these videos is like, you know that this is just for entertainment, right? They're not trying to be scientifically accurate. So I just want to get it out of the way right now. Yes, I do know that this is all in good fun. This is just for educational purposes. I enjoy this series. I'm not trying to dump on it at all. But if a series does try to include science, and especially neuroscience, it is still fun to talk about. So that's what we're going to be doing today. Specifically, we're talking about season 5, episode 10, called 50 Shades of Grayson. And that's where they do mention a little bit of neuroscience. Also, as usual with all of these videos, in order to avoid any copyright laws or whatever, I am going to be skipping over any parts of the episode that don't have to do with science. So if you want to watch the full episode, it's on Netflix. You can go check it out. So without further ado, let's get started. So we're starting off with this episode with our two main characters, Damon and Elena, being trapped in a makeshift research facility. And this should be obvious to everyone watching, but the first scientific thing to point out is that we do recruit willing participants whenever we do human or vampire studies. And even if this were fully ethical and they were fully willing participants, I don't know of many or even any studies that require the participants to stay for days on end. There's really no reason for them to be in this constant observation. So he's trying to escape. So kind of skipping over all of that because it really has nothing to do with the science. Basically, he MacGyvered his way out of that cell and went to go and find help, but Elena is still stuck with the researcher. And something that we're not going to get into in this episode, but something that I think is kind of important to mention for anyone who's familiar with the series. This researcher is an MD PhD who teaches at the local university, which I would say is a pretty rare circumstance. Usually MD PhDs are much more on the medical side of things and maybe at a teaching hospital, but are much less likely to be found at a university. So she's waking up on this table. She's been anesthetized, I assume. One thing that always cracks me up whenever science is shown in movies and TV is all of these bright lights around. I have been in operating rooms. I've been in research for several years. I have never seen such a well-lit room. Normally you will have these bright lights over the direct area that you're working with, but all of these ring lights set up everywhere are just very unrealistic. You'd be under normal hospital fluorescent lights, or in this case I think they're in a basement. Just the basement light would be on, especially since this is not supposed to be well-funded or public research. There's no need for all of these lights everywhere. You would just have a good light over the area that you're working on. Oh, and I guess relevant for anyone who's not familiar with the show, she is a vampire, and the person who has kidnapped her knows that she's a vampire.
Subject 83182 appears conscious.
The other thing that always cracks me up in media is I understand as a narrative device, you need to have a way for the researcher to be talking about their research. But never in my whole time in research have I seen someone talk into one of those little like recording devices. We just write it down in our notebook. The only time I have seen someone use one of those recording devices is I did shadow a surgeon one time, and even then he didn't use it while he was doing surgery. After he got out of surgery, he would go and then record his notes on the surgery. So again, like I get the need for it narratively, but it's extremely unrealistic.
Where am I?
Why? Look familiar?
What is that thing? What are you doing to me?
3182, commence prep for blood dialysis.
Count from 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5.
So as far as I'm aware, the point of the surgeon telling, or the anesthesiologist telling you to count down from 10 is to sort of relax you and get you to take those deep breaths. There's not like an actual medical purpose why you need to count back down from 10. And the anesthesiologist would not be the one doing the counting for you.
4.1 pints drained. 83182 still shows signs of consciousness. Note that 15 years ago, subject 12144 faded into unconsciousness after losing 2.9 pints. Evolution or luck? Mystery for another day.
I think this is my big like nitpick with this episode and with the way that this show portrays science in general. Yes, there were many experiments back in the day where scientists just kind of did whatever to figure out whatever. They were like, I wonder what happens if I like poke a dog with a needle. Like, it was very upsetting and very unethical research that was done back in the day. Nowadays, you have to get your research approved by ethics committees, and an ethics committee would never agree to you being like, I'm just going to drain this vampire of all of its blood and see what happens. You have to have some sort of hypothesis behind your research. Now, clearly, as this is being done in a basement and this is on vampires, he did not go through an ethics board, but I just want to bring in that perspective of what would happen if this were actually being done.
What are you doing to me? What are these tubes? Let me go!
Relax. I plan to, once I'm through with you.
My friends are gonna find me.
Your heroic vampire friends.
Did you know Aaron Whitmore spent his entire life...
I'm also confused if he's trying to drain the blood from her. Like, anytime that you go to donate blood, they have the blood bag below you. That way gravity can work with it and sort of flow with it. So the fact that he has the blood bag way above her is just not helping him get this done any faster.
thinking his family was haunted by some death curse? Turns out that curse was your boyfriend, systematically killing every member on his family tree. I'm curious, how does one justify that in her mind?
And this? Holding people against their will? Torturing them? How do you justify that?
Science.
See, this is where my problem comes in, because science would not justify this. No part of what he was doing would ever even really be considered science, because for it to be scientific, you start off with a theory, you start off with a hypothesis, and then you experiment to either prove or disprove your hypothesis. Well, you can't really ever prove a hypothesis. You can only find evidence in support of your hypothesis, because there's always the possibility that in the future it'll be disproven. But that's a lot of like details to get into. What he's doing is just torture, because he doesn't have any sort of theory behind it. He doesn't have any like, I'm trying to prove this thing. And he's not doing it in replicates, which is also a big thing that you need to be able to repeat your research. And he's just doing this on one vampire. So like, no part of what he's doing is science.
June 25, 1999. Incredible findings today. After enduring 3,000 volts of electricity, the subject continues to have a heartbeat. June 26, more success. Subject was exposed to 4,000 volts today. Season continues after electrocution. Flesh remains hot to the touch.
You're a monster.
This is my journal, Elena. These are the handwritten medical findings of Dr. Grayson Gilbert, your father.
What?
Everything I'm doing to you, I learned from him.
When did you meet my dad?
He was working with Augustine to turn vampire blood into a magical cure-all, to fight disease, cure cancer, save the world.
So what's wild to me about this is, like, in the vampire lore of Vampire Diaries, vampire blood is already a cure-all. Like, you can just drink some vampire blood, you're cured of, like, literally whatever is the problem at the moment. It can, like, nearly bring, like, someone could be, like, the medical field has given up on them, they are about to die, they drink some vampire blood, they're totally fine. So all of this experimentation to, like, find cures, make cures, is literally not necessary at all, because, like, this organization that's doing the research has figured out that, so all they need to do is collect some vampire blood and get people to drink it. So, like, really all of the experiments that they're doing that's really just torturing vampires has no place in science. They've already found the solution. This is kind of similar to, like, in medical research, there's a concept, and I forget the technical term for it, but essentially if you're going to do clinical trials on someone, if a cure or a treatment has already been found for that thing, you're not legally allowed to have people, like, have, like, a proper control group. So, like, a proper control group would not be taking any medication at all, and then your group would be taking medication. But if this is a deadly disease that we have a treatment for, your control group would be taking whatever the standard treatment is, and then you would be experimenting with your thing. That would be the experimental group. That way we're not just letting people needlessly suffer. And so basically your medication has to be better than what is already the standard, instead of just being better than nothing. So, like, in this series, if they were truly doing what was, like, ethical and doing, like, proper medical research, they would just be giving people vampire blood and then maybe, like, on the side trying to figure out other stuff, but they would start giving people the vampire blood. Please comment below if this is the type of content that you thought you would be seeing on a Neuroscientist page.
Save your energy. Drained enough blood to start phase 2.
Let me guess. You're not gonna tell me what phase 2 is, are you?
If it works, you'll be the first one to know.
So clearly we've established that this is not at all ethical research. But if this were to be an ethical medical trial, what would happen is that you would be fully informed the entire, like, every step of the way. The only stipulation that they can have in medical trials is, like, clearly you can't know whether you're receiving the control treatment or the experimental treatment, or else that may throw off the data. But what they would likely do is explain to you, like, hey, if you have the control, here's what to expect. If you have the experimental, here's what to expect. You can't know which one you have, but this is kind of what's going on. I don't think there's any ethical situation where they could just, like, call you into the office and be like, hey, we're gonna do some experiments on you. We're not gonna tell you what it is. My cat has joined us. I'm sorry if you've been hearing her in the background. She's been screaming out there for me to let her in. But even, like, I have some friends who are in psychology research, and in psychology, sometimes you can't always, like, tell the participants what the experiment is going to be, or else that could throw off the data. But what they are required to do whenever they're doing the informed consent, they sort of, like, make up, like, a hypothetical experiment and then tell you what the potential risks of that hypothetical experiment could be, and those will match up with what the actual risks of the actual experiment are.
Why didn't Megan have a picture of my dad in her cell phone?
Maybe because her parents helped fund your father's projects.
They knew about Augustine too?
Well, no. All they
This confused me so much whenever I was first watching it. So the smoke coming out of that box, I would assume is meant to be, like, dry ice or liquid nitrogen, which is used frequently in research. But anytime you're injecting something into, like, a person, an animal, whatever, you want to bring it up to room temperature if that's possible, just for the comfort of the patient, and so it doesn't, like, mess with, like, your body temperature. I assume that they were doing this just to make it look, like, more creepy and more, like, mad science-y, but it really does not make that much sense.
regulated compound that could cure most injuries.
Vampire blood.
Exactly. But as Megan grew up, she got suspicious. Enrolled at Whitmore, roomed with Dr. Gilbert's daughter, and she went to a party at Whitmore House and put her nose where it didn't belong.
She found Enzo in his cell.
And being clueless to what a starving
Ignoring every word that he's saying, like the compound that he has that was in the liquid nitrogen or in the dry ice or whatever is now, like, completely liquid, which could just mean that it has, like, a really high freezing point or a really low freezing point, you know, so, like, it freezes at, like, really, really low temperatures. Either way, though, he really should have let it come up to room temperature, and I think realistically it probably wouldn't have been in, like, liquid nitrogen or dry ice.
will do around fresh human blood. I'm guessing she got too close. again.
Where's Elena?
Who's this?
We have Aaron, and we're trying to decide how to kill him.
Funny. I have Elena, and I'm wondering how she'll function without her cerebral cortex.
The answer is not well. So to bring in the first bit of neuroscience for this episode, the cerebral cortex is basically like the outside part of the brain. So if you go like more deeply like inside the brain, you get like what's called like the lizard brain. The cerebral cortex is very important for like thought, for rationing, reason, stuff like that. It can also be important for some fine motor skills. Just overall, it's very necessary for a human being to function as a human.
Good news. The sample cells mutated. My compound worked.
I don't follow. You kicked me out of bio, remember?
You've heard of Pavlov? Conditioned his dog to salivate at the sound of a bell. This compound is like that bell, except instead of a ding, your body will salivate at the smell of vampire blood.
This is the thing that whenever I saw this, I was like, I need to do a reaction video to this to explain stuff, because I actually work with Pavlovian conditioning. I do Pavlovian conditioning on rats. And the concept of Pavlovian conditioning is like fairly simple nowadays, but it was like a big deal whenever Pavlov discovered it. So the way that like the story goes is that Pavlov was feeding his dogs, and like every time that he fed his dogs, he would ring a bell. And he noticed that the dogs started, like whenever he would ring the bell, they would salivate, even though there was no food out yet. So like a good scientist, he repeated this experiment and sort of verified it, and now created like what we now call Pavlovian conditioning. To break it down like really as simple as I think I can get it, what happens is you have what's called the unconditioned stimulus, and that's something that an animal would like normally react to. And so like for Pavlov's example, it would be food. And this unconditioned stimulus, the food, results in an unconditioned response. So this is just a natural innate response that the animal has, like salivating to food. But what Pavlov found was that you could pair a conditioned stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus. So the conditioned stimulus is the ringing the bell. Like dogs don't normally really react to ringing a bell by salivating. But by getting the dogs to associate ringing the bell with eating food, the dogs would then begin salivating to ringing the bell. And there truly are medical examples of people doing this. The best example medically that I can think of is that there is a medication that's been made for people with alcohol use disorder. So to sort of train people with alcohol use disorder to no longer crave the alcohol, this medication makes them like puke or feel nauseous whenever they consume alcohol. So what they're doing is getting these people to associate the taste of alcohol with the unpleasant feeling of nausea. This can also be used in a pleasant way. I think there was an episode of like The Big Bang Theory where someone was trying to train their boyfriend to do something, and so they gave them like a piece of candy every time that they did something positively. That's Pavlovian conditioning. What is not Pavlovian conditioning is injecting someone with a medication one time and then now they crave vampire blood. I would have to assume that would be some sort of like gene editing, or really I cannot think of a medication that works by only one injection that has like a long-term effect. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I am just a neuroscientist. Maybe a medical doctor could think of one, but I cannot. Regardless though, it would not be considered Pavlovian conditioning.
That's what you did to Jesse. You turned him into some rabid vampire who only wanted to feed on other vampires.
Jesse was a fantastic case study, but he took too long to condition. And considering the size of the vampire population, a single dose injection is much more efficient.
Yeah, but
See, what he did initially, so this is like several episodes back, I believe would be considered Pavlovian conditioning, because he got like some vampire blood and he trained this vampire to consume vampire blood. So I feel like maybe not exactly Pavlovian conditioning, but is like some form of conditioning, versus what he's doing here is just injecting some compound that maybe does something.
couldn't stop feeding. You tried to kill Damon.
Exactly. Vampires are now one shot away from craving their own kind. And you're about to be patient zero.
No, you can't do that to me. You'll turn me into a ripper.
I know.
See, also, they're taking a bunch of medical terms that I don't think the writers knew what they meant necessarily, or maybe they used them incorrectly on purpose. But whenever we talk about like patient zero, that's referring to things that are contagious. So let's say like this new disease happened, not to bring in current events, but let's say like there's like a new disease, and we're trying to trace back where this new disease originated. We're going to trace every person who's gotten it, who they were in contact with, if those people got it, and eventually arrive at a patient zero who began the spread of it. What this guy is talking about would be like a subject zero. So like in his trials, she would get like the number 0 because we don't want to name people because that affects like that could affect the data based on like people being biased. So we do give people numbers. I know it's a very like nitpicky difference, but I do feel like it's an important thing to distinguish between.
Subject A3182, prepped for compound injection.
No. Please, you can't do this to me.
We'll be doing the world a favor, Elena. I might not be able to kill vampires.
No, let me go.
But you will.
Elena!
Stop it.
My least favorite thing in every single show that depicts a medical researcher is that they act like the point of delivery does not matter. So whenever you're giving injections need to be delivered in different ways depending on how the medication needs to be absorbed by the body. So I can't think of any medications other than adrenaline that gets shot into like the chest, and the only reason adrenaline gets that is like in emergency situations. Most things like most vaccines are intramuscular, which is why they give it up here. They're injecting it into that muscle. There's also like IV injections, which people have had like overnight stays in the hospital are probably familiar with, or like whenever they're drawing blood, they usually go into like this vein up here. But they could technically go into really any vein. There's subcutaneous injections, which go like right underneath the skin. So they'll like pinch up a little bit of skin and they'll go just right underneath it. There's all sorts of routes of delivery. There's like oral medications, like the over-the-counter ones that you take like in the mouth. And every medication kind of has its own way that it needs to be delivered, or like it'll specify which like route of delivery it needs to go through. And most shows that I've seen where someone gives an injection, they don't pay any attention to that. They're like, you just stab it somewhere, and then sometimes they don't even press on the plunger. This show at least was pretty good about pressing down the plunger, but sometimes they'll just like stick it in there and be like, we're good. And that's not how injections work.
Let's out here. I'm here.
And that's where I'll end it. Everyone lives to see another day. Everything's fine. She's been rescued. So I know I've been posting a lot less frequently on here. Something that I just wanted to say real fast is that I post much more frequently on my TikTok. So if you want to go check out all of my different social medias, but specifically the TikTok, you can see more of what I'm doing. You can see some stuff in my lab. You can see I like explain how I section brains, stuff like that. Really neat over on my TikTok. Also feel free to give this video a like and a follow. And please feel free to comment or email me more suggestions for different shows or movies or even like other YouTube videos that you would like to see a neuroscientist react to. And I will see you next time I feel like posting. Bye.